The morning of our anniversary, I made coffee for two. That's the part that stays with me. Not the note. Not what came after. Just the sound of the coffee maker doing its job while I stood at the kitchen window, watching the sprinklers run across the front yard the way they did every Saturday at 7. I had set that timer myself, years ago, when we first moved in. I had said a lot of things in this house. Her name was Diane. We met at a church potluck when I was 58, recently widowed, and not looking for anything except maybe a decent casserole. She was warm. She laughed easily. She had a daughter named Brianna who was 23 at the time, living at home, working part-time at a nail salon and taking what Diane called a gap year that had somehow stretched into its third calendar. I didn't mind. I'd raised two sons of my own. I understood that kids take time to find their footing. What I didn't understand, not yet, was that some people aren't looking for footing. They're looking for someone else's. I was a retired civil engineer, 34 years with the county. I had a pension, a paid-off truck, and a house in Tucson that I'd shared with my late wife, Carol, for 26 years. When Carol passed, I sold that house because I couldn't sleep in it anymore. I bought something smaller, a 2-bedroom on a quiet street with a lemon tree in the backyard, and I told myself that was enough. Then Diane came along, and I told myself something different. We dated for a year. She was attentive in the beginning, the way people are when they're still performing the best version of themselves. She remembered that I liked my steak medium rare. She asked about my sons. She called me on the drive home from her shifts at the dental office where she worked the front desk, just to talk. I was 60 years old, and I had forgotten what it felt like to have someone call, just to talk. We got married on a Saturday in April. Small ceremony. My two sons came. Her sister came. Brianna was the maid of honor and gave a toast that was mostly about herself. We moved into my house. That was the agreement. My house, my furniture, my lemon tree. Diane said she loved it. Brianna came too because Diane said she just needed a little more time to get settled. And I said, of course. And I meant it. And that was, as I look back, the first in a long series of doors I opened that I did not know how to close. Brianna was not a bad person in any dramatic way. She was something harder to name. She was comfortable with being taken care of in the way that some people are comfortable with the weather, as though someone else's effort on their behalf was simply a condition of the world, unremarkable, owed. She ate meals she didn't help make. She watched television in the living room until 2 a.m. and left her glasses on the coffee table and her shoes in the middle of the hallway. When I mentioned it once, gently, she looked at her mother, and Diane said, "She's still adjusting, Raymond." Raymond. That's me. 61 years old, gray at the temples, bad left knee from a hiking trip I took in my 50s that I have never fully stopped paying for. I coached Little League for 9 years. I volunteered at the County Blood Drive every November for 2 decades. I am not a man who complains easily, but I am also not a man who forgets things. I did not forget the morning I came home from my weekly breakfast with my friend Harold and found that Brianna had rearranged my garage. She said she needed space for her craft supplies. I asked, what craft supplies? She gestured vaguely at several plastic bins I didn't recognize. I moved my toolboxes to accommodate them, and I did not say what I was thinking. I did not forget the Thanksgiving, where Brianna's boyfriend, a man named Derek, who had the handshake of someone who has never finished anything, sat at my dinner table and complained that the turkey was dry. I had brined that turkey for 18 hours. Diane laughed it off. I passed the gravy, and I did not say what I was thinking. I did not forget the conversation in March, about 8 months after we married, when Diane mentioned, in the careful tone of someone who has been rehearsing, that Brianna was struggling financially and that it might be nice if we could help cover her car insurance for a few months. $212 a month. I said yes because I was trying, because this was my wife. because I believed that being a good husband meant being generous with the people my wife loved, even when it cost me something. Those few months became a year and a half. In that time, I also paid for the crown on Brianna's back molar that her dental plan didn't fully cover. I paid for the registration on her car when she let it lapse. I quietly put $300 in an envelope when she told Diane she was short on a security deposit for an apartment she was supposedly getting. An apartment that never materialized, which I only discovered because I asked 6 weeks later how the move was going. And Diane changed the subject with the practiced ease of someone who has changed that subject before. I started keeping a small notebook. Not out of suspicion, not at first. Just because I am an engineer, and I think in numbers, and I wanted to understand what was happening. By the end of the second year, the number at the bottom of the last page was $11,400. I showed Diane that number one evening after dinner. I wasn't angry. I was calm, the way I'm always calm, the way my sons tease me about, the way Carol used to say made her feel safe. I laid the notebook on the kitchen table and I said, I think we need to talk about this. Diane looked at the number for a long moment. Then she said, I didn't realize you were keeping score. I said I wasn't keeping score. I said I was trying to have a conversation about our finances and our household and what was sustainable. She said Brianna was going through a hard time. I said Brianna had been going through a hard time for as long as I had known her, and that I was starting to wonder if the hard time was a permanent condition or a strategy. Diane's face changed, not into anger, exactly, into something cooler. She said, That's a terrible thing to say about my daughter. I said I wasn't trying to be terrible. I was trying to be honest. She said those two things were the same to her right now, and she went to bed. We didn't finish that conversation. We didn't finish it the next day either, or the day after that. Diane had a way of letting difficult things dissolve into the ordinary rhythm of the week, and I had a weakness for letting her, because it was easier than the alternative, and because I was 61 years old, and I had already buried one wife, and I did not want to lose another. So the notebook went into the desk drawer, and I told myself we were fine. Brianna, for her part, seemed to understand that something had shifted. She was slightly more careful for a few weeks. She rinsed her dishes. She said thank you at dinner once, then, gradually, she returned to herself. Derek started coming over on weekends, then on weeknights. Then one Friday I came home and found his jacket on my coat rack, and his boots by my front door, and his car in my driveway, in the spot where my truck went. And I parked on the street and I sat in my truck for a moment before going inside, just breathing. That night, I told Diane that I was uncomfortable with Derek essentially living with us without any conversation about it. She said he wasn't living with us. He was just spending time there. I said his boots were by my front door. She said I was being territorial. I thought about the word territorial for a long time after that. I thought about what it means when a man in his own house, the house he bought, the house where his lemon tree grows, the house where he carried his late wife's photographs in boxes, when he moved in and hung them in the hallway because this was his home and she was still part of it. What it means when that man is called territorial, for noticing that a stranger's boots are by his door. I didn't say any of that. I said, okay, Diane. And I went to the garage to work on a birdhouse I'd been building for no particular reason, except that it gave my hands something to do. Our second anniversary came. I made a reservation at a restaurant we'd been to on our first date, a steakhouse downtown with low lighting and good bread. I bought her a card. I wrote in it for a long time, trying to say something true about what I hoped we still were to each other. She was quiet over dinner. Not unhappy, exactly. Distant. The way she'd been increasingly for months. I asked if everything was all right. She said yes. I asked if she was happy. She said, of course. I asked if there was something she wasn't telling me. She looked at her wine glass for a moment, and then she said, Raymond, I think I need some space to think. I asked what that meant. She said she wasn't sure. She said she cared about me. She said things had been complicated. I said things had been complicated in ways I'd been trying to talk about for over a year. She said she knew. She said she was sorry. She said, let's just enjoy tonight. We drove home mostly in silence. She went to bed early. I sat in the kitchen with the lights low and looked at the lemon tree through the back window, which was just a dark shape in the yard at that hour. And I thought about Carol, who would have told me the truth even when it hurt, because she believed that was what love required. The next morning, a Saturday, I woke up and Diane was already gone. Her car wasn't in the driveway. I thought maybe she'd gone to get coffee or to see her sister. I made breakfast. I ate alone. By noon, she still wasn't back, and she hadn't called. I found the note on the kitchen counter, folded in half, leaning against the sugar bowl. It was short. 4 sentences. She said she had gone to stay with her sister in Phoenix for a while. She said she needed time to think. She said Brianna would be staying at the house for now, and she hoped I could be respectful of that. And she said, at the end, that she thought it would be best if I found somewhere else to stay while she sorted out her feelings, and that she'd be in touch. She thought it would be best if I found somewhere else to stay, in my house, where I had lived for 11 years before I ever met her, where Carol's photographs still hung in the hallway, where the sprinkler timer I'd set was still running on its Saturday schedule because nobody had told it to stop. I stood at that counter for a long time, long enough that the coffee maker beeped twice, which it does when it's been sitting on the burner too long. I turned it off. I read the note again. Then I folded it back along its crease and I set it down carefully. The way you set down something you want to remember exactly as it was. I didn't call her. I didn't call Brianna. I didn't make any noise at all. I went to my desk, opened the drawer, and took out the notebook. Then I picked up the phone and called my son, not to cry, not to vent. My older boy, Thomas, is an attorney in Portland. Family law, mostly. I called him because I am a man who deals in structures, in load-bearing walls and drainage and things that hold or fail to hold, and I needed to understand exactly what was holding what and what I was legally permitted to do about it. Thomas answered on the second ring. I told him what the note said. There was a pause. Then he said, Dad, tell me everything. We talked for 2 hours. What I learned in those 2 hours was this. The house was mine. My name. My deed. My mortgage. Paid off 7 years ago. Whatever Diane had assumed or hoped or implied to her daughter, there was no legal ambiguity about who lived here by right. What I also learned was that, in Arizona, a spouse has certain rights regardless of whose name is on the deed, and that a separation without legal guidance could become complicated quickly, and that the cleanest thing I could do was to begin that guidance immediately. Thomas said, Do you want to save the marriage? I thought about the note against the sugar bowl. I thought about $11,400. I thought about being called territorial in my own home. I thought about Diane's face at dinner when I asked if she was happy, and she said, of course, the way she looked at her wine glass instead of at me when she said it. I said, no. Thomas said, okay, I'll call you back in the morning. I did not find somewhere else to stay. I slept in my own bed. I watered my lemon tree. On Sunday morning, I made coffee and drank it on the back porch and watched 2 sparrows argue over something in the grass. Thomas called at 9 with a name, a local attorney named Patricia, who had an opening Monday at 1. By Tuesday, she had sent Diane formal notice. By Wednesday, I had submitted a petition to begin proceedings. I also made some other phone calls. I called the bank where Diane and I had opened a joint account 14 months earlier. I spoke with someone there and explained the situation and was told what my options were. I exercised them. Not all of them. Just the ones Thomas had advised. I canceled the automatic transfer I'd set up to cover Brianna's car insurance. I removed my credit card from the account Diane used for household groceries and had a new card sent to my name only. These were not acts of cruelty. They were acts of clarity. I was giving everyone exactly what had been asked for. Space. Separation. Lines drawn where lines belonged. Brianna called me Thursday morning. I let it go to voicemail. She said she didn't understand what was happening and that she needed to talk to me. Her voice had the quality of someone who has realized, perhaps for the first time, that the floor was not as permanent as they thought. I didn't call her back. Diane called Friday. I answered, because she was still my wife and I am not someone who avoids hard things. She said she'd received the paperwork. She said she was shocked. She said she hadn't meant for things to go this far. I asked her what she had meant when she wrote that note. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said she had just needed some room to think. I said I understood that. I said I had also needed room to think, and that thinking was what I had done, and that I had thought very clearly. She said she thought we could work through this. I asked if she had told Brianna that the car insurance would no longer be covered. She said that wasn't the point. I said it was one of the points. She said I was being cold. I thought about that. I have been called steady, patient, too quiet, a little too much in my own head. Cold was new. I held the phone and looked out the kitchen window at the front yard, where the sprinklers were not running because it was Friday and they only run on Saturdays. And I thought about how many systems I had built and maintained in this house without anyone noticing. I said, Diane, I spent 2 years trying to talk to you. I'm not being cold. I am being done. She hung up. They came back from Phoenix 11 days after the note. I know because I was home when they pulled into the driveway, Diane in her car, Brianna following in hers, and Derek, somehow, in a truck I didn't recognize. The three of them arriving together like a delegation. I was on the back porch with a book. I heard the front door. I stayed where I was. Diane came through the house and found me outside. She looked different than I expected, not triumphant, the way I had braced for. Smaller, somehow. She stood in the doorway between the kitchen and the back porch, and she looked at me, and then at the yard, and then back at me. She said, Patricia sent a second letter. I said yes. She said, the joint account. I said I'd spoken with the bank. Brianna appeared behind her. She had her phone in her hand the way young people carry them, like an extension of the arm. She looked at me and then at her mother and then back at me. She said, can someone explain what's happening? I said the house was mine and I was filing for divorce and that I wished them both well. Brianna said, but where are we supposed to go? It was an honest question. I could see that. She genuinely did not know. And something about that, the genuine bafflement of someone who had never had to make a plan because someone else always absorbed the consequences, that more than anything is what told me I had made the right call. Not because she was a bad person, but because this was a dynamic that had gone on long enough, and someone had to be the one to say so, and it was not going to be anyone but me. I said, that's a really good question to start asking. They went pale. Not all at once. It moved across their faces the way weather moves, something changing in the light behind the eyes, a recalibration. Diane sat down on the porch step without saying anything. Brianna looked at her phone as though it might offer a different version of this conversation. Derek, I was told later, waited in his truck for 45 minutes, and then drove away. I cannot confirm this because I never saw him again. The divorce was final 7 months later. Arizona is a community property state, which means that assets acquired during the marriage are divided. But the house predated the marriage and had never been jointly titled, and Patricia was thorough, and Thomas flew down for the final hearing. And when it was done, I shook my attorney's hand and drove home and sat in my own driveway for a moment before going inside. I thought about Carol. I thought about how she would have handled this, and I knew the answer was that she never would have created it, because Carol was a woman who believed that the people you love deserve honesty even when honesty is costly, and she had lived that way until the end. I thought about what I would have done differently, maybe spoken sooner, maybe closed the first door instead of opening it and waiting to see what came through. Maybe, but I had been trying to be a good husband to someone who had decided that a good husband was a resource, not a partner. And there is only so much you can do with a decision that isn't yours. I made coffee. I drank it at the kitchen table. The house was quiet in a way that had shape to it, a fullness rather than an absence. My sons called that evening, Thomas from Portland, my younger boy Marcus from Denver, both of them checking in, both of them using the same tone they'd had on the phone throughout this whole business, the tone of men trying to be steady for their father, the way their father had tried to be steady for everyone. I told them I was fine. I told them I was better than fine. I told them to come visit soon because the lemon tree had gone absolutely wild this year, and I didn't know what to do with all of them. Thomas laughed. Marcus asked if I'd learned to make lemonade yet. I said no, but I was thinking about it. Some evenings now I sit on the back porch after dinner and I watch the yard go dark, and I think about the kind of patience that becomes a problem. I was patient the way engineers are patient, waiting for enough data before drawing a conclusion, believing that things have load-bearing logic underneath them if you look long enough. What I learned is that some things don't. Some things are simply taking advantage of the load-bearing patience of the person who built them. I am 63 now. My knee still bothers me on cold mornings. I have breakfast with Harold most Saturdays. I volunteer at the blood drive every November. My sons visit at Thanksgiving, and Marcus brought a woman last year who has a good laugh and actually complimented the turkey without being asked. The sprinklers still run on Saturdays. I set that timer myself. Nobody has changed it because nobody needed to. This is my house. It always was. It just took a note against a sugar bowl for me to remember what that meant and what I was willing to do about it. I hope that's useful for someone. I think you know what to do.